UAP observations and metric engineering, patterns and examples from the 20th and 21st centuries. So why does this subject matter? And I have 3 points here about why it matters. First, a very large number of UAP sightings have been reported and published in various forms over the last 80 or so years, basically since World War II. And I mean, arguably, in our email discussions, we've had many discussions about how maybe there are valid reports of UAP and such craft going back before World War II. But you have modern sort of organizations like MUFON and so on have been around more recently and putting those together. So as I say here, some of the sources and publications appear credible and are reported in a reasonably intellectually rigorous manner. And the second point is that since 1994, the concept of the Alcubierre spacetime warp bubble has gradually evolved into greater detail in theoretical physics, leading to the creation of various theories about how such metric engineering effects might be created. Similarly, the Moritz-Thorne wormhole metric, another metric engineering effect, has had significant discussion since the 1980s. And third, although metric engineering is still a field in its early stages and there's disagreement about exactly how warp bubbles might be created, there's been sufficient discussion to put in place some outlines and make Alcubierre type metrics a possible explanation for some UAP observations. So, amongst the core points here, the argument here is that a significant number of UAP observations correlate well with what we would expect to see from Alcubierre type warp bubbles, usually operating at slower than light speeds when people see them in the atmosphere, or when the USS Nimitz has its encounter, the F-18s have their encounter with the Tic Tac. The Tic Tac isn't operating at faster than light. And Alcubierre, his metric originally was for faster than light, but we'll get into this later in the talk, how as the topic has evolved, there's also, Jack has spoken a lot in the last few years about how it can function slower than light as well. So I know Jack will say, well, this is, the metric engineering warp bubble effect is really the only real explanation. I mean, just as a point of academic rigor, I will say that this may not be the only possible explanation, but it is one that should be studied extensively. And it is the explanation that is preferred by some of the physicists participating here, including Jack. And this talk is just a beginning. The history of UAP observations is a topic that can be continuously added to. And as I've already mentioned, some organizations have collected literally thousands of sightings of UAP events. And here we're looking at some representative examples and general patterns. And then the next slide, I know a lot of people have been annoyed by Addinall, but I do like to make the point that conventional explanations are already being studied. Addinall's Galileo Project will explore propulsion options such as rockets and light sails in terms of observations of unusual phenomena around the Earth and in the solar system. In overview of the Galileo Project, Loeb and a co-author write that they will also work on eliminating sightings caused by natural and human-made objects or phenomena. So that's already being done. We don't need any of these arguments about, oh, why are you guys looking at warp drive and so on, when it's like there's Addinall and there's others who have been and continue to look at all the possible conventional explanations. The separate effort that looks at metric engineering as an explanation is therefore arguably warranted. So, structure for the rest of this talk. The preceding 4 slides were outlining the why. Why should we talk about this? And the remainder is organized into the following parts. First, an overview of the literature on metric engineering, in particular Alcubierre warp bubbles. Second, a discussion of some of the characteristics of warp bubbles that would correlate with widely noticed characteristics of UAP sightings. Information pointed out over the last few years by people like Luz Elizondo and by websites like UAPtheory.com is relevant here. And I mean, well, we'll get to it, but this is, I'm not quoting Elizondo in any detail, but things like the 5 characteristics slide, which is later in this presentation. We'll see. And then third, a review of a few examples of more compelling work covering UAP observations and how various of the sightings discussed in those works support the pattern of correlations between expected characteristics of metric engineering warp bubbles and the widely noted characteristics of UAP sightings. And I like to add, because I'm a military historian as well, this will hopefully provide a basis for historians and social scientists to engage with this topic, not just physicists and engineers, although obviously the physicists and engineers are the most important to engage with this topic, but it would be good to get some more multidisciplinary thought happening. So, starting with the metric engineering literature here. The Einstein-Rosen bridge and Schwarzschild wormholes were described in the physics literature soon after general relativity was developed. Ludwig Flamm published a bridge-type metric, and Schwarzschild wrote about a type of eternal black hole that could function a bit like a traversable wormhole around 1916. And Einstein and Rosen published their bridge description in 1935. Traversable wormholes were then discussed in a paper by Homer Ellis and also in another paper by K.A. Bronnikov, both published in 1973. In 1988, Kip Thorne and his graduate student Mike Morris published a similar traversable wormhole metric as what Ellis had written, in part to provide a more realistic and non-technobabble method for faster-than-light travel in Carl Sagan's book Contact. And there's from the Wikipedia page. I mean, most of us here know this stuff, but there's your two-dimensional representation of the four-dimensional wormhole, a sort of metric drawing. And then also, like this one on the Wikipedia page, is an image of a simulated traversable wormhole that connects the square in front of the physical institutes of the University of Tübingen with the sand dunes near Boulogne-sur-Mer in the north of France. The image is calculated with 4D ray tracing and a Morris-Thorne wormhole metric, but the gravitational effects of the wavelength have not been simulated. So that's maybe a bit more realistic than what the sort of metric drawing is. So, nonetheless, despite this, the papers that have been written about them, traversable wormholes have not usually been seen as metrics that could be generated in a practical manner by foreseeable technology. Morris and Thorne argued rather that their model was useful for teaching general relativity. They wrote, "Rapid interstellar travel by means of space-time wormholes is described in a way that is useful for teaching general relativity." And about contact here, you see, they note that many objections are given against the use of black holes or Schwarzschild wormholes for rapid interstellar travel. A new class of solutions of the Einstein field equations is presented, which describe wormholes that, in principle, could be traversed by human beings. It is essential in these solutions that the wormhole possess a throat at which there is no horizon, and this property, together with the Einstein field equations, places an extreme constraint on the material that generates the wormhole's space-time curvature. And Morris actually has their original essay published at that. It's online at that URL. So then in 1994, Mexican theoretical physicist Miguel Alcubierre, then at the Department of Physics and Astronomy at the University of Wales, wrote the paper, "The Warp Drive, Hyperfast Travel Within General Relativity." That paper was published in Classical and Quantum Gravity, issue 11.5. Alcubierre stated that it has shown how, within the framework of general relativity and the introduction of wormholes, it is possible to modify space-time in a way that allows a spaceship to travel with an arbitrarily large speed. By a purely local expansion of space-time behind the spaceship and an opposite contraction in front of it, motion faster than the speed of light as seen by observers outside the disturbed region is possible. The resulting distortion is reminiscent of the warp drive of science fiction. However, just as it happens with wormholes, exotic matter will be needed in order to generate a distortion of spacetime like the one discussed here. And Alcubierre's original paper is also, it's up on arXiv at that URL. And that's his original 1990s graphic of his warp bubble effect. I mean, the important features here when you look at this is, and this comes back to the discussion that we were just having. The interior area of the warp bubble metric here is flat. You can see the middle is flat, so there's no g-forces in there. And this is what Jack and Creon were, the point they were trying to make. You need that flat area where it doesn't matter if the mass is reduced, you're still going to feel the g-forces if you don't have this sort of flattened out area in the center. And then the part behind this peak is illustrating the expansion of space-time in one direction, and the trough is like any drawing of a gravity well that people do in a book. That's the space-time being contracted on the other side of the craft, and that's how it can move this expansion contraction around as it generates it, but that's how it moves in directions. And there's a more recent illustration of the same thing, but that's with after the year 2000 graphics. So since Alcubierre published his paper, a significant amount of additional work on warp bubble metrics has been done. For example, if you search for warp drive on arXiv, as of right now in May 2023, you get 203 results. So a thorough literature review of the topic would be an extensive project in itself, which should probably be undertaken by a physicist. In email discussions amongst Jack Sarfati and some other physicists and the rest of us, over the last 10 to 15 years, we have occasionally one of these papers like of the 203 in arXiv comes up. It's a point of discussion. We discussed the Notario variation a couple of times, but in general, you can summarize that some of these papers make modifications to the warp bubble metric, which make it appear less impractical as a realizable technology. So then, in terms of U.S. government interest, we see that Hal Puthoff wrote the paper Advanced Space Propulsion Based on Vacuum or Spacetime Metric Engineering as a Defense Intelligence Agency reference document. In the now declassified Advanced Aerospace Threat and Identification Program, or ATIP product list, it is listed as unclassified for official use only. And Federation of American Scientists has that ATIP list online there. So again, anyone who's interested, I can send you my presentation here, or I can send you all of the links if you don't know where to get them. So going on, the paper's traversable wormholes, stargates, and negative energy and anti-gravity for aerospace applications by Eric Davis were also included on this list, again as unclassified for official use only. Puthoff published his paper in the Journal of the British Interplanetary Society in 2010. He wrote that a theme has come to the fore in advanced planning for long-range space exploration in the concept that empty space itself, the quantum vacuum or space-time metric, might be engineered so to provide energy or thrust for future space vehicles. Although far-reaching, such a proposal is solidly grounded in modern physical theory, and therefore the possibility that matter-vacuum interactions might be engineered for spaceflight applications is not a priority ruled out. As examples, the current development of theoretical physics addresses such topics as warp drives, traversable wormholes, and time machines that provide for such vacuum engineering possibilities. We provide here from a broad perspective the physics and correlates or consequences of the engineering of the space-time metric. And again, his paper is on arXiv as well. So I'm going to go over a few of the points he makes in detail because they're really one of the first examples of where the expected behavior of warp drives was starting to be characterized, and we can correlate this with UAP observations. So Hal says, the concept of engineering the vacuum found its first expression in the physics literature when it was introduced by Nobelist T.D. Lee in his textbook Particle Physics: An Introduction to Field Theory. There he stated, the experimental method to alter the properties of the vacuum may be called vacuum engineering. If indeed we are able to alter the vacuum, then we may encounter new phenomena, totally unexpected. This legitimization of the vacuum engineering concept was based on the recognition that the vacuum is characterized by parameters and structure that leave no doubt that it constitutes an energetic and structured medium in its own right. Foremost among these are that first, within the context of quantum theory, the vacuum is the seat of energetic particle and field fluctuations, and second, within the context of general relativity, the vacuum is the seat of a space-time structure or metric that encodes the distribution of matter and energy. Despite the daunting energy requirements to restructure the space-time metric to a significant degree, the forms that such restructuring would take to be useful for spaceflight applications can be investigated, and their corollary and attributes and consequences determined. From such a study, the signatures that would accompany such advanced technology craft can be outlined, and possible effects of the technology with regard to space-time effects that include such phenomena as the distortion of space and time can be cataloged. This would include, among other consequences, cataloging effects that might be potentially harmful to human physiology. Amongst the effects that Puthoff observes are redshift, writing, should such a time-slowed condition be engineered in an advanced aerospace application, an individual having spent time within such a temporally modified field would, when returned to the normal environment, find that more time had passed than could be experientially accounted for. If uninformed about the metric engineered characteristics of the environment from which he emerged, the individual might be inclined to interpret the experience in terms of a missing time. Conversely, for other types of engineered space-time associated with an advanced aerospace craft, time flow within the altered space-time region would appear sped up to an external observer, while to an internal observer, external time flow would appear to be in slow motion. In this scenario, close approach to a craft could leave one with the impression of, say, a 20-minute time interval, whereas only a few minutes would have passed in real or normal or exterior time. A corollary would be that within the space-time altered region, normal environmental sounds from outside the region might cease to be registered, since external sounds could, under these conditions, redshift below the auditory range. An additional implication of time speed up within the frame of such an exotic craft technology is that its flight path might seem precipitous from an external viewpoint, such as sudden acceleration or deceleration would be experienced as much less so by the craft's occupants. From the occupant's viewpoint, observing the external environment to be in relative slow motion, it would not be surprising to consider that one's relatively modest changes in motion would appear abrupt to an external observer. And then I've noted here, again, amongst our discussion group, the view that's at the flat space-time region in the center of an Alcubierre warp bubble should have no g-forces at all. But again, these things were like when Hal Puthoff was writing his paper, this is really just being written up in a rigorous manner for the first time. So, and then other features that he notes also include that a craft's properties might appear hardened relative to the exterior environment due to the increased binding energies of atoms in its material structure. So it could, say, impact water at high velocities without apparent deleterious effects. And we do see in some videos, we see the UAP going into water and coming out. And I know there could be different arguments exactly about how it's doing that. I'm not sure that we would currently agree with Puthoff's statement here, but again, it shows the effects that can be expected to arise. He notes radiation hazards for external observers, which we've discussed extensively in recent years by email. He notes a craft appearing to shrink from the perspective of a remote observer when you're standing somewhere and you see a UAP in the distance, and people report sometimes they seem to change in size. There can be refractive index effects such as cloaking or blinking out where the craft disappears, and or it looks like it disappears to the external observer. And I note that Puthoff's paper may have been what popularized the term metric engineering. I don't know, Jack, maybe you can comment later. Maybe you started using it first in the 1990s or something, but it's but you don't really see it that often before about 2010 in this paper. So, and then vacuum engineering, vacuum engineering, space-time modification, and other such terms would also be reasonable. But metric tensor engineering or simply metric engineering seems to have caught on. And so it's what I'm using throughout this presentation. So apart from those papers in the literature review, then we have a few other people doing things that are worth noting. I mean, at NASA Eagle Works, you had Harold Sonny White. He claimed creation of a nanoscale warp bubble in a custom Casimir cavity, although there's disagreement as to whether this was actually a meaningful result. And the debrief.org, it is some articles on Eagle Works topics. There you see a nice Eagle Works graphic of what Eagle Works says we could do if we have the warp drive in terms of interstellar travel. Then you have Woodward, James Woodward. In 2013, his book, Making Starships and Stargates, was published by Springer. It is a peer-reviewed book, but nonetheless, Woodward's model of the universe has drawn criticism for mixing a Newtonian gravitational potential with general relativity theory. In the book, Woodward included a proposal to obtain negative energy densities from metric engineering by exposing the negative bare mass of electrons based on the Arnowitz-Dazer-Meissner model of the electron. And Jack has criticized this specific aspect of Woodward's theory, as well as Woodward's theory more generally, writing that the bare mass of the electron is at the scale of classical electron radius 10 to the power of negative 13 centimeters. The cloud of virtual photons is at 10 to the power of negative 11 centimeters. The real far-field photons in Jim's contraptions are of much longer wavelength and lower energy, and they cannot strip away the virtual photon electron-positron pair plasma to expose the naked negative mass in the ADM model. And then we have Jack's variation of warp drive theory itself, which, of course, Jack will talk about much more later during this conference. But Jack has proposed a low-power version of the Alcubierre warp drive. It focuses on reducing space-time stiffness, or put another way, increasing the coupling between a coherent electromagnetic field and space-time. And Jack has worked out in detail various aspects of how such a drive would operate at sublight speeds. And what Jack comes up with includes many of the same effects that Puthoff predicts in his DIA Journal of British Interplanetary Society paper. And that leads us to an interesting point about the shape of warp bubble spacecraft. Although the theoretical basis is very difficult, it's very different. Both Woodward and Sarfati have models in which the warp bubble has to be generated in the skin of the spacecraft. Woodward proposes layers of piezoelectrics. Sarfati believes that certain types of metamaterials will work, but that a great deal of additional research is likely necessary in order to figure out exactly what kind. Such models suggest that the shape of the spaceship has to fit the shape, at least the inside of the shape of the warp field, that flat area, a bit like a hand has to fit inside a glove. So as a result, you would expect to encounter craft shaped as relatively simple geometric objects, flying saucers, tic-tacs, globes, and so on. And here is from CNN a picture of a kind of a house, 1950s flying saucer house. I thought it's amusing, but it makes the point that, you want a simple, relatively simple structure to do the warp bubble calculations and fit inside your own warp bubble. And there is a screenshot of PBS of one of the USS Nimitz videos with the tic-tac in the distance being recorded by a F-18. And so, again, a relatively simple shape. So then, as I mentioned at the start, I was going to mention Elizondo and some of the others to the Stars Academy. I mean, they generated a few of these slides that we send around in our discussions. This particular ATIP slide, it covers a number of things like stuff that you also see at Skinwalker Ranch, but you do see the point in here of anomalies in the space-time construct, and the comment that what was considered phenomena is now quantum physics. So that's important in taking metric engineering seriously. And then there's the 5 observables slide. So this really, in a simpler way than the Puthoff paper, this summarizes it nicely. Number 1, sudden and instantaneous acceleration. Number 2, hypersonic velocities without signatures. 3, low observability. 4, transmedium travel, like being able to fly through space and then the atmosphere and then into the water and back out of the water, and positive lift without any obvious thrusters like rockets or jet engines. So continuing with these characteristics of UAP, the website UAP Theory is a reasonably well presented summary of the sort of effects we've already seen discussed. For example, it states that requiring that UAPs are consistent with the laws of motion leads us to a gravitational propulsion system, for lack of a better term, which has the following implications. First, that UAPs should be rounded geometrical as there is no preferred forward-facing direction. Since they use space-time as their control surface, they need no wings or afterburners. Second, UAPs can maneuver in sharp angles at high speeds because they move on geodesics and in zero-G. I mean, basically a slightly different set of 5 points, but making the same points that we've seen so far. And the UAP theory side also has some nice videos on it, like the bunch of versions of the 2013 Puerto Rico UAP video. So it's a good introduction if you know someone who you think should learn about metric engineering and UAP warp drives, get them to read that site. So now we're moving on to the sort of sources we can use to correlate between those the theory and the characteristics and what people actually report seeing. So quality of reports from organizations like MUFON can vary, and as I show here, some commentators attack the quality of MUFON reporting, complaining that all sorts of stories of alien abductions, conspiracy theories, human ET hybrids, and so on are unscientific. So some of us here will disagree with that. We'll say that all those things are things that have to be investigated. Others may say, yeah, we want to keep the intellectual discussion more rigorous. But we do have more rigorous sources than, say, MUFON. For instance, one source that ties together accounts of UAP observations with a theory of metric engineering type propulsion is Unconventional Flying Objects by Paul R. Hill. And I'm just going to quote from Robert M. Wood, who is also a physicist and engineer, aeronautical engineer, who wrote the foreword to Hill's book. Wood wrote, NASA aeronautical engineer Paul R. Hill began to collect and analyze evidence about unidentified flying objects during the 1950s, but he could not publish anything about UFOs while employed by NASA. After Hill died in 1991, it was possible to publish the book that he wrote while working for NASA. Hill was a good engineer. He designed the fuselage for the World War II P-47 fighter bomber, and his UFO analysis drew on his knowledge of the physics and engineering of flight. While at NASA, Hill designed and flew a machine that used the same basic principle of thrust. And when we don't use thrust anymore because that's not actually what's going on with Alcubierre drives. But again, remember, Hill is doing this before, he's looking at UFO, UAP observations before all the theories worked out. So he made something that kind of it could hover on air pressure, but he didn't have the anti-gravity drive. That drive would have allowed the principle to explain the observed near-Earth performance of UFOs, and by extension, their interstellar performance. Hill knew that UFO technology so far exceeded the capability of terrestrial technology that UFOs could not have been made by present-day humans. Hill's approach was 20 years ahead of its time. He never became trapped in the endless speculation about the reality of UFOs. He accepted the reports at face value and let his analysis of the observed phenomenon speak for itself. And his methodology was impeccable. He took the reported observations and then directly evaluated alternative hypotheses, exploring all relevant aspects of the observations. His comprehensive analyses dealt with size, color, halos, clouds, wakes, jitter, heat, maneuvers, performance, sound, solidity, landing, weight, nests and rings, propulsion, propulsive forces, force fields, radiation, merging systems, occupants, collection, interference, weaponry, and artifacts. So, and then again, my own commentary based on that. Based on subsequent work on the Alcubierre warp drive, we would now say that there is not thrust involved in the UAP movement, but nonetheless, by deduction, Hill reached the conclusion that UAP were using what he conceived of as artificial gravity force fields before the physics literature based around Alcubierre's 1994 paper came into being. And I'm getting near the end. I know I'm going on a bit long here, but it's some good stuff to look at. So another well-written and reasonably intellectually rigorous book covering a number of UAP sightings is the 2010 book, UFOs, Generals, Pilots, and Government Officials Go on the Record by investigative journalist Leslie Kean. Michio Kaku provided a blurb for the cover of the book. He wrote, "At last, a serious and thoughtful book about this controversial subject." Kean was also one of the authors of the New York Times articles in 2017 that discussed the ATIP program and included on the New York Times website copies of some of the 3 U.S. Navy F-18 UAP videos. So writing about what drew her to the subject, Kean states 10 years ago. So as her book came out in 2010, that would have been about 2000 or 23 years ago now. As an investigative reporter working for a California public radio station, I was suddenly confronted with a seemingly impossible reality. A colleague in Paris sent me an extraordinary new study by former high-ranking French officials documenting the existence of UFOs and exploring their potential impact on national security. Now known as the Cometar Report, this unprecedented white paper marked the first time in any country that a group of this size and stature had declared that UFOs, solid but as yet unexplained objects in the sky, constitute a real phenomenon warranting immediate international attention. The distinguished Cometar authors, 13 retired generals, scientists, and space experts working independently of the French government, had spent 3 years analyzing military and pilot encounters with UFOs. In the cases they present, all conventional explanations of something natural or man-made had been eliminated by the authors and their associated teams of experts, and yet these objects were observed at close range by pilots, tracked on radar, and officially photographed. They achieved tremendous speeds and accelerations, made sharp right-angle turns in a flash, and could stop and stand still in midair, seeming to defy the laws of physics. What could this mean? Since some of the military officers on the Cometar panel were serving with the French Institute of Higher Studies for National Defense, a French government-financed strategic planning agency, their characterization of UFOs as a phenomenon with possible national security implications assumed a grave importance. And then she talks a bit more about their 90-page report and that they thought that the most logical explanation was the extraterrestrial hypothesis. I comment, and again, we just had this in our discussion an hour ago, that a warp bubble moving at faster than light speeds could also, in theory, allow travel into one's own past light cone. Because that's Jack can explain it better than me, but that's within general relativity. If you can bypass the light speed limit and move faster than light, you can necessarily achieve trajectories that will take you into your own past. So the point is that rigorously documented UAP observations correlate well with the expected behavior of craft operating on the principles of the Alcubierre drive and metric engineering. And then last but not least is, of course, the recently released U.S. Navy videos, which the U.S. Navy acknowledged as authentic in after 2017, and they can be found at these website addresses. But I mean, you can also find the UAP videos all over YouTube, so you don't have to go to the government website to download them. So conclusion, again summarizing, the behavior of the UAP in the U.S. Navy videos is again consistent with the theory that these craft are operating using the principles of metric engineering. No apparent thrust, no jet or rocket engines, no propellant, no and ability to accelerate very quickly, and so on. Essentially, as has been argued in this presentation, a number of sound sources documenting UAP observations in detail exist, and the accounts detailed in them correlate with an Alcubierre warp bubble type technology. Does this prove that these are warp drive craft? Based on conversations with Jack, I expect that he would say yes. I do not think that we can actually say anything for sure without having empirical proof, either retrieval of a crashed craft or building one ourselves. However, the correlation is strong, and there is enough evidence to support continued multidisciplinary as well as theoretical physics research of the metric engineering option. So, that's my talk.